I'll let my parents live in this house. You can't even cook, so leave lol, Mark said to me with a grin, like he was proud of himself. I was so shocked I couldn't even respond. There is no way I would let my parents live in my house and then try to move in with my in-laws without my permission, and try to kick me, the owner of the house, out. I've been bothered by Mark's bossy attitude for a while, but now it's really upsetting. I can't keep living with Mark if he keeps acting like this. I've decided that Mark needs to face consequences. My name is Sarah, and I'm a housewife in my 40s. I live with my husband, Mark. Mark is a house husband. He doesn't work but takes care of the housework because I have a job. I work to earn the money we need. All of this is to have a stable life with Mark, but it feels like my efforts are pointless. Mark has a very controlling personality. It's not that I think there's anything wrong with being a stay-at-home husband, or that men should always work, but even though he's not working, he acts like he's the one in charge and is protecting the house. Out of the blue, Mark would say something like, "I'm so tired today, I want some ice cream, go buy it for me," while lounging in the living room at 11 p.m. The convenience store isn't far, but after a hard day at work, I was exhausted and annoyed by his demanding attitude. "Why don't you go get it yourself? It's just a short walk to the store," I replied, sounding harsher than I intended. That's how much Mark's behavior irritated me. When I refused, Mark chuckled and said, "You think that's how you should behave? You never know what will happen if you upset your husband. He always acts like he's the man of the house and deserves respect because of it." Honestly, I'm fed up with Mark acting superior and expecting respect just because he's the husband. Every time he behaves this way, I feel more and more frustrated and unwilling to deal with him. At that moment, I realized that if I kept dealing with Mark on top of my already stressful job, my stress would become unbearable. So I said, "I'm really tired. I'm sorry, I'm going to rest in my room." But Mark didn't like my response and stopped me, saying, "Wait, what's with that attitude towards your husband? I could kick you out right now if I wanted to. Do you think it's alright to upset your spouse like that?" He looked angry. Who does he think he's kidding, acting like the boss when he doesn't even work? He can upset me whenever he wants, but heaven forbid I upset him. It's just like a child's tantrum. "I'm sorry, but I'm really exhausted. Please understand," I said with a forced smile, not wanting to talk anymore. Mark sighed deeply and muttered, "You're such a disappointment as a wife." At this point, I didn't have the energy to argue, so I just said, "I'm sorry," again and went to my room. Day by day, I was worn down by Mark's overbearing behavior, but I didn't have the energy to confront him about it. That's how exhausted I was. Then one day, I caught a bad cold. The doctor said it was a stress-induced fever, and the first thing that came to my mind was Mark. I was so sick that I couldn't move, so I took a day off from work and could only lie down in bed. When I told Mark about my condition, he snapped, "A cold? That's just an excuse. Go to work, you're useless." His words seemed to make my fever spike even higher. He added, "I won't be taking care of you. This is your mess, deal with it." So I was left alone in my room, moaning from the fever. There were no ice packs or anything to help. I was too weak to prepare anything for myself, and I didn't want to face Mark again for fear of more verbal abuse. My temperature reached 103 degrees Fahrenheit. The fever was so high that my body was drenched in sweat. I couldn't even get up to change my clothes, even when they were soaked. I thought, how much easier would it be if I could just pass away with these thoughts? I endured a painful night alone. Maybe it was the fever, but I couldn't sleep at all. Even when the sun set and it was time to see the night sky, feelings of loneliness and doubt overwhelmed me, and it was unbearable. I really wanted Mark to help, not necessarily to bring down my fever, but just to get me an ice pack, bring a cold compress, and say, "Are you okay?" But that was just a fantasy. The words I actually received tore at my heart, leading to new anxieties that tormented me. Why must I be the only one to feel this way? What did I do wrong? Why can't things go well with Mark? Once these thoughts started, I couldn't stop the tears. It was just so painful. After about 3 days of rest, my fever finally subsided and I was able to return to work. My colleagues and bosses were concerned, asking, "Are you sure you're all right?" But my health was improving, and more than anything, I had to support the household. When I mentioned that I couldn't afford to take more time off, they seemed even more worried. Their kindness, which was so much more than the attitude I received from Mark, brought tears to my eyes. I guess my emotional breaking point was close. A voice inside me was screaming that I couldn't deal with Mark any longer. I was ignoring that, pushing myself too hard. This way of life wouldn't last forever. Someday I'd reach my limit and wouldn't be able to get back up. Deep down, I knew that, but I didn't have the presence of mind to deal with the situation before reaching my limit. By this time, my affection for Mark had already faded, but I didn't have the energy to start planning to live separately. How could I clear these feelings? With these worries, I worked hard every day, came home exhausted, and dealt with Mark's whims. This was my daily life. One day while I was relaxing in my room, Mark called out, "I have something important to discuss. Come here." It had been a long time since we had a serious talk. Usually, Mark wouldn't inform me about various things and would make significant decisions on his own. So with a sinking feeling, I wondered what this was about. As I sat down for the discussion, Mark, with an excitement I'd never seen before, said, "I'll let my parents live in this house. You can't even cook, so leave." Oh. The first word that slipped out was, "What?" "You need to leave because you're living with my in-laws," he continued. I couldn't accept the reality of Mark's utterly selfish remarks, but he continued pushing forward with the conversation. He wanted to change the ownership of the house so it belonged to him and his parents. He planned to divorce me and start a new family, stating that his decision was final, and my opinions wouldn't change it. I felt overwhelmed by decisions made without any regard for my feelings. My parents were thrilled when I suggested they move in with us. They've missed me, and I need to take care of them as the head of the household. Mark, full of himself with his man-of-the-house mentality, only thought about his own needs. I knew I couldn't go on with Mark any longer. My heart told me it was impossible. Ignoring my feelings, Mark chuckled, "You love me so much, don't you? I know this is shocking coming from a husband you love so dearly, but I'm sorry. I just want to take care of my family. Please understand," Mark said in a tone that felt like a rebuke. But I wanted to respond, "That's not true at all." I had no affection left for Mark. What remained was disbelief at his selfish actions and regret for not ending things sooner. Why hadn't I left him earlier? If I had, Mark wouldn't have taken advantage of me so much or been so selfish and arrogant. I even despised my past self for being too weak to let him go. Seeing my distress, Mark seemed to misunderstand, thinking I still loved him and didn't want a divorce. But that couldn't be further from the truth. My feelings for Mark had faded long ago. All that was left was disgust for a man who thought I still cared despite everything. To make myself clear, I spoke up, "Fine then, I'll leave." At those words, Mark exclaimed, "What?" Clearly, he hadn't expected me to agree to a divorce and leave so readily. He needed to realize that the old me, who used to bail him out, was gone for good. From now on, whatever happens to Mark, I won't be there to help him because we won't be a couple anymore. Seeing my determination, Mark looked shocked and frozen in place. I seized the moment to head to my room and pack the essentials. I couldn't take larger items today, so I'd have to arrange for movers later. As I prepared to leave, Mark hurried over and asked, "Are you sure about this? If we divorce, we'll be strangers." I smiled and replied, "I've already fallen out of love with you. Letting go feels like a weight lifted off my shoulders." Hearing this, Mark stood there looking lost. I nodded, said, "Thanks for everything," and walked out of the house. Mark had a worried look on his face. After I returned to my parents' place and explained everything, they were furious with Mark's behavior at first, but calmed down once they knew I had a plan. I started recovering at my parents' home while sorting out various matters, starting with the divorce. After sending the divorce papers, I received a message from Mark. "Are you sure about this? I don't know if it's really a good thing, but I don't have any feelings for you anymore. If we've gone this far and he says there's no divorce, that would be a problem. I feel so much better now that you're gone, so fill out the divorce papers quickly." When I replied, there was no response. A few days later, I received completed divorce papers from Mark, with his sections already filled out. I promptly completed my parts and submitted them to the county office on the same day. Now Mark and I are officially divorced. I no longer have to support the household as Mark's wife. During the divorce, we divided our assets. Mark got the house as he had originally insisted on it, so I transferred ownership to him and decided to move on. The house was never really comfortable for me anyway. It had been more of a burden. Instead, I decided to seek alimony from Mark. His parents covered it since he wasn't working, but now he's actively job hunting, likely planning to repay them once he finds a decent job. However, reality doesn't always follow plans. A month passed after the divorce was finalized, and I moved out of my parents' home into a new place, enjoying a peaceful life. Then I received a call from Mark. Honestly, I found it annoying. I immediately guessed why he was calling, but ignoring him might lead to more complications. So knowing I'd have to talk to him sooner or later, I decided to address it now for the sake of my own future. "Hello, what do you want after all this time?" I was completely fed up with dealing with Mark. I wanted him to get to the point quickly. Reluctantly, I answered the phone, and he pleaded, "Please help me." His desperate tone made me chuckle. I knew Mark was in a tough spot, but I hadn't expected it to be this bad. "Well, what's going on? You need to tell me the whole story," I replied, half amused. I had a feeling about why Mark was in trouble, but I wanted him to explain it himself. When I pressed him, Mark started explaining hesitantly, stumbling over his words. He had taken over the house after our divorce and managed fine for a month. But now he had a rent payment due. Being unemployed, he couldn't cover it himself, so he asked my former parents-in-law, who were on a pension, to help out. However, the bill was much higher than they expected, around $1,800. There was no way they could afford that on their fixed income. My former in-laws were furious, insisting, "This isn't what we agreed to." They laid the blame squarely on Mark. Lost and uncertain, Mark called me in tears, asking for help. I didn't realize the rent would be so high. "The place is a mess now. What are you going to do about it?" Frustrated, Mark was now blaming me. It was true I hadn't mentioned the rent specifics earlier, but it was Mark's own folly to take over the house without knowing its monthly costs. He had treated me like an outsider and pushed me away, and now he was facing the consequences of his actions. Despite this, he couldn't accept responsibility and instead reached out to me for help. I couldn't help but sigh at his audacity. Ignoring my feelings, Mark continued urgently, "Please, I need your help. We can't keep going like this. I need you." His desperation was clear in his voice. They must be feeling incredibly trapped right now. The rent due date had likely passed, meaning they might already be behind. The landlord of that house was known for their short temper and strict policy on rent payments. I remembered being warned repeatedly when I rented the house, never be late with the rent. If they missed a payment, they were in for serious trouble with the owner. Mark had met the landlord a couple of times and knew how intimidating they could be. He must have been desperate when he called me for help. "Please just cover the rent for 1 month. I don't have anyone else to turn to. You still care about me, right? If someone you care about is in trouble, you should help them out," Mark pleaded, his tone still self-centered. "My feelings for you have long since faded." I wanted to say those words, but I held back and replied coldly, "I'm sorry, but I don't have any obligation to help you. You were the one who cut me off. Now you expect me to assist you when it's convenient for you? That's not fair." Mark defended himself. "Please don't be so cold. I really can't handle this alone. Whether you still love me or not doesn't matter now. We were married once, right? Can't you help me out just this once?" "No, you were the one who left me. Even before that, my feelings for you had already cooled. It's been a long time since I stopped loving you." When I heard Mark's dejected voice on the other end of the phone saying, "I can't believe it," it struck a chord deep within me. For so long, I endured everything. Even when Mark was selfish, took me for granted or mistreated me when I was sick, I stayed by his side, hoping to salvage our marriage. I worked tirelessly for the life we had, but this was the outcome. Why hadn't I left sooner when my love for him faded? Why didn't I distance myself earlier? These regrets flooded in, mingling with the anger I felt towards him. Mark never truly faced me. He never showed real concern, never protected me, and never embraced the idea of navigating life together as a team. All this time, he treated me like a maid, a mere money-making machine. Each time he acted this way, he seemed oblivious to my suffering. Yet now, despite all this being a result of his actions, he came pleading for help as if he were the victim. His self-centered attitude was repelling. "Please help me. I'm begging you. What about getting married again? Let's start over properly this time. I promise I'll never push you away again," Mark proposed, desperately. I couldn't help but chuckle bitterly at Mark's desperate suggestion. "Remarry you? Are you kidding me? All of this is the result of your own actions. I've been trying to work things out in my own way for a long, long time. I kept hoping you would face reality. And now you want me to start over with you, pretending none of that ever happened? Do you expect me to go back to those miserable days? That's never going to happen. I refuse to return to that life, no matter what." I became so emotional that tears started flowing. I couldn't tell if they were from anger or sadness. Mark remained silent in response to my words. Unable to continue the conversation any longer, I simply said, "Goodbye," and hung up. Mark didn't call back, and wanting to avoid hearing his voice ever again, I blocked his number. Later I heard from mutual friends that Mark and his family were evicted from their home. Mark attempted to persuade my former in-laws to cover his rent, but they were furious, refusing his request and upsetting the landlord in the process. Left with no choice, they had to leave. Mark hasn't had much success finding a full-time job and is now working part-time to get by. Because they had to sell their house, my former in-laws are now squeezed into a rundown apartment, all three of them together. Meanwhile, I've been deeply focused on my work, and my boss has even discussed a promotion with me. There's a possibility I might become the first female manager in our company, and I've been receiving admiration from both colleagues and juniors. Sometimes friends inquire, "Aren't you thinking about getting married?" Honestly, after my past experiences, I have a rather negative view of marriage. The idea of dating or marrying again doesn't appeal to me right now. But life is long and there's no rush. Many people in this generation live their entire lives happily unmarried. What matters most to me is living a life without regrets and staying true to myself. With that in mind, I want to continue navigating life at my own pace.